Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video, I want to ramble on for a bit about Killer and its activation rate. If you've ever paid attention actually to how often Killer kind of activates off of kills, you'll notice that it's more than the 6 out of 10 times that you would kind of expect for a talent that would have a 60% activation rate basically underneath it to activate. And there's actually a really good reason for that. And we're kind of gonna, not per se in-depth look into it, I just want to ramble a little bit about it because just to lay it out there. And then maybe in the future, we might actually revisit this as an in-depth look. But just now, for now, just to discuss the idea and kind of talk through why it actually does activate more than 60%. We can show that visually, and we can also verify that with the game by itself, because it does happen kind of that way. For that, we'll be using a spreadsheet that I've kind of prepared here. This, of course, will be linked down below, so you can jump to that and kind of look through it for yourself and play around with it as well as I'm going to here in a second. And yeah, we're going to kind of go through here and kind of explain how Killer's activation rate actually, quite often ends up being a little bit higher than the 60%, and sometimes as well much higher, and why it is very much a talent that can be used very consistently and much more consistently than the 60% would lead you to believe. So yeah, let's start jumping into this and going from there. And we are gonna base most of that discussion for this rambling talk upon these two builds, which is a Striker and an Umbra initiative versus each other, but also just to visualize the difference that we're kind of going to discuss in a second. First off, to lay out the builds, it's as I'll be linked down below as well, but it is an Obliterate Striker. Both of them, though, even though build picture here shows it with a FAMAS, both of them are with the Lexington, with Killer, of course. And then also the Umbra, same way, the Coyote Fenris backpack with Vigilance setup for it at full stacks, at empty stacks and such. And if we kind of go back here and let's zoom in a little bit, we have all three of them, starting out with no stacks here at the very top. Then we have them at full stacks, so where we would consider Strikers with 100 stacks, we would consider UI having been in cover for long enough to get our buff, and then pulling out of cover, and then just that very small moment when it's still at the full bar, that's its full stack. Then here as well, we have that same full stack, and then plus K being Killer. And this is, of course, their burst and sustain DPSs kind of showing up here. But what we're kind of more concerned about here is actually their checking numbers, as we have here, where we can, and I've checked it versus in-game and double check that I've input everything correctly. And that is the difference between body shot and crit shot. So, of course, with builds that are very, as we kind of run them, very crit heavy, most of our builds, even a Striker at no stacks has, of course, kind of 60 crit chance, 151 crit damage, although as well. This is with Coyotes at 15 to 25. Both of the builds have Coyotes in them, so we're just setting that at mid-range, basically. We're adding quite a bit of damage when we actually crit. And that is the important factor here. As we'll kind of lead up to as well, just to not bury the lead too much, it is mostly here about the difference, as we kind of have on these charts here. The blue is basically the non-crit, and this is, for instance, this is in the bottom here, it's in the same order as we have the builds at the top, basically all 6. The blue is the non-crit, the red is the crit. We of course also see that in number form, basically on here, this is what that is derived from, and the ratio especially between the two. So this is this number showing here is basically the crit divided by the non-crit, and how much percent, basically how much of a multiplier is it over the crit over the non-crit. And that is actually the thing that causes the difference. Our crits are so much larger, especially if we're going for a build like UI, which is also feeding into crit even more. And of course, Killer itself also feeding into crit much more, means that when we're hitting an enemy, the normal shots will of course hit, and you would maybe, if the bar of the enemy would need 4 normal shots, what it would need, if we're kind of looking at these ratios here, the crit would be 2.5%, for instance, here with the unstacked striker, 2.5 times larger than that non-crit. So you would only need 2 crits to kill it. So actually, if at any point, basically you get 2 non-crits and then a crit, that crit would kill it. For it to be the non-crit, it would need to have multiple of them in a row. And especially, of course, as you're getting closer to the end of the enemy's health bar, if just one crit creeps in, kind of, it might actually jump over multiple non-crits and basically guarantee and make that kill a crit kill. And that is actually the reasoning behind all this. We also kind of see here then with strikers, it actually kind of stays the same ratio, especially when we're stacking up. And that makes sense, of course, because we're dealing with a separate multiplier coming in from both obliterate and of course from the striker stacks. With the Umbra with its talent, it feeds into RPM and it feeds into crit damage. Especially that crit damage component feeding into it makes it so that when we're actually fully stacked, our crits are of course much larger because we have bigger crits. That is kind of the way that build works. It feeds its damage into crit. And that does make a difference. Now, our crits are basically, as we see there, almost 4 times as big as our non-crits. So especially with a talent like Killer, that would make a difference. Because now, actually, if anywhere between the last 4 shots, any of them is a crit, basically, it is very likely that that crit will kill that enemy. You would kind of have to have 4 consecutive non-crit shots to kind of have that kill shot be a non-crit, because of course if any of those shots in there is kind of in the last 3 shots, especially here as we have it at a 3.81, if any of those last 3 shots is a crit, which is going to happen 60% of the time, so higher than a 50-50 out of 3, overall the activation of Killer will happen there. And then of course then we have Killer coming in and adding even more crits. And now, for instance, here, even for Striker, it's a 3.21 ratio. So basically, the crit is 3 times as large as the non-crit. So out of the last shots, if any of the last 3 shots is basically a crit, the crit was going to kill because it's just in that one shot going to finish that enemy off. With a non-crit, you would have to have basically 4 consecutive non-crits basically to actually have it be a non-crit. And this is the reason that Killer actually does activate as much as it does. And for my end, this especially looking at footage, it's very clear, like you would expect, if this factor wasn't in there, that it would just be a 60% activation. What it ends up being is much higher. And one of the things that I've been trying to kind of maybe try to quantize in a way is, can we use this ratio together with our crit chances to maybe make a newer number? And honestly, I kind of gave up, because actually that was the thing that I was kind of looking into when I was updating the table or the talent calculator months and months ago. Although actually it was, February-ish, March-ish of last year. So a long time ago, before also actually Killer, of course, got its big upgrade. But I kind of wanted to look at this in that way, but I kind of gave up. And actually, as a call to action, if you have a good idea to how to more than this, because here we're just looking at basically the ratio between crit and non-crit and kind of factoring that in and then separately from the crit chance, could we actually derive in a meaningful way maybe a new percentage that we could apply as our like Killer activation rate? I'm kind of doubtful, mostly because actually the methods to do that with, we would need to kind of set an enemy's health bar, where we're kind of then leaning into the issues that Time to Kill and such has, where you have to kind of pick a thing to be the thing that you base it off of. But yeah, we can go, even just this ratio by itself, I feel, looking at the crit versus the non-crit, having that number be there is actually very useful information. Would we per se build towards this? Not really, because at the end of the day, we kind of see that Umbra, even like in its best form, is pretty far behind Striker. So we're not just gonna pick this just because we can get killer activations more. No, because Striker and at the end of the day is much easier to use than Umbra. But I think it is an interesting discussion piece to kind of have. So yeah, let's actually move on to these charts down here, and let me actually just visualize as well. If maybe it wasn't clear yet, let's try to visualize it a little bit and maybe try to make it clearer. And in my attempt here to kind of maybe make this more visual, maybe if it isn't per se clear what I'm kind of talking about, just to kind of show it in this way. We have here the bars basically from our builds up above. This is basically the no stacks ones of the strikers and the UI. Then they're at full stacks, and then as well full stacks plus killer. So the same numbers as we had above. And then basically bars, the blue bar being basically our non-crits, the red bar being our crits, side by side. And we can kind of also see the difference, for instance, yeah, as well, between strikers and a UI, even at full stacks and such. And this is, of course, why we can go with strikers, partially as well, because both of their bars are kind of higher as well. And that leads to much higher DPS. But that's rambling maybe too much here. Then what we have here is that we're turning them sideways. This is the same 6 bars, but then sideways just kind of, I feel that makes a little bit more sense for what we're going to do here, which is that we have this red bar, kind of signifying the red bar of an enemy, the health of an enemy. If we then take, and we'll leave the circle to the side for a second, but, or I'll put it kind of there. If we then take, for instance, just one of these bars and kind of move it up, you can see that with the blue damage, we would, of course, need like quite a bit of them to kind of add up into one kill if we're kind of measuring it out. But of course, with the red, it is much, much less. So what will happen, and we can kind of take for instance here, let's take the 2 Umbras where the base actually is, the blue is basically the same size consistently because we're not gaining any separate multipliers coming in or such. If we kind of put the blue here at the end of one of them, or well, even the non-stacked one, let's actually take the red. The red, of course, covers up a much larger distance where it can be the kill shot. And that is basically the discussion that we're having here, is that for this to be a kill without the crit, we would need several shots in a row towards the end to not have a crit. In this case, for instance, 3, basically, because this blue kind of fits in a little less than 3 in there. But we would need consecutive non-crit shots for there not to be the kill happening with the crit. And this does affect actually a lot how often this activates. And of course as well, once we have killer going, as we kind of have with some of these later bars, if we take the Umbra with killer also active, that blue, of course, now we need basically all the way back here is the last time that it can have a non-crit. Any point after this, basically, or well, that actually, any point after this, if a crit were to happen, starting from basically where the blue is starting, any point after that, if a crit were to happen, it would be the kill shot, of course, because even up to here, the crit would just finish off the enemy. And of course, for the non-crit, it would have to be all the way back there. So we would need several consecutive non-crit shots for it to get to the end of the bar of the enemy. Whereas, of course, we have a 60-40 basically for it to be crit if we're maxing out our crit. So that is the reason that killer activates as much as it does. It is very much that it is the crit is so much larger of a number than the non-crit. It's not the 60-40 that we kind of think of it. It is basically a 60-40, but then also the ratio of how much bigger the crit is than the non-crit. And that does mean that we can kind of consider building towards that, but that comes also at a disadvantage. The more crit we were to have, and the more we neglect our normal damage, first of all, the less we gain from killer. A build with very low crit chance crit damage, or well, especially low crit damage. Let's say you're doing 60, 120 as a build versus 60, 180. For a build, the 6120 of course gains actually a lot more from killer. It would just do, if the rest of the stats were the same, it would just do less damage overall, but it would gain more from killer. Whereas the other one would gain less from killer, but overall is already doing more damage to begin with if the other stats are the same, and then the killer on top. So you have to kind of think as well that this is a side thing that can be considered here or there, but at the end of the day, we're definitely going to keep in mind that the DPS is still the most important thing. And then this is just more of a quirk to kind of first understand as well how we are getting that higher activation rate than 60. And then also together with that, how sometimes if you do have the choice to kind of go maybe more towards crit, to maybe do that. So for instance, one thing would be that Fox's Prayer, especially if we're kind of comparing, you have already Cheska. If you're putting in a Coyote, that would usually be the pick, right? If there's already enough Coyotes, instead of, for instance, going Fox's Prayer, which will apply to both the non-crit and the crit, if you're running Killer, Grupo will be likely a better choice. Usually that already is the case. You wouldn't want to put a Fox's Prayer in a Strikers. It is actually a loss overall against Grupo, still to this day, especially unless you're just considering it at 100% active, which you shouldn't. At best, it's 90% active usually. Well, not at best, because at best, there are places where you can get 100% out of it. But yeah, that is for those kinds of considerations. So especially if you are going Killer, to maybe if you have two choices that are pretty close to each other. So for instance, even if we kind of go to our build where we have Umbra here, although in this case with Umbra being such high damage by itself, crit damage, the difference between Fenris and Grupo is actually pretty small here, especially if we're full red and also graded to 25 as we are here. So actually, maybe if we are maining Killer with this, which would be a good pick anyway for Umbra, even in a group setting, just because it has so much of a higher ratio, much more of its kills will be its Killer, and then as well, when Killer is activated, its other kills will much more likely also be reactivating Killer. But yeah, maybe just a choice, for instance, here to go, if I'm maining Killer, to kind of go with Grupo. Although of course here we could also go with Measure. Although yeah, Killer does gain us overall more than Measured. Here as well, we're kind of pushing crit damage so high that we're kind of reaching very high diminishing returns on that. So for instance, in here, then we have to kind of consider holistically that maybe Measured might just be a better option, and then keeping the Fenris. But yeah, just to kind of discuss these things. That's also why it's not a per se an in-depth look, kind of looking in-depth into all of these. We might do a little bit of that maybe in the future, maybe if I'm a little bit, maybe if we find a better way to maybe quantize all of this maybe into a percentage fully. We'll kind of maybe revisit this, but for now, just to kind of put the idea in there. And yeah, to conclude this video, this was just a short-ish ramble for my things. I kind of wanted to visualize what is kind of happening here and to kind of show it in that way, and hoping to kind of make it more understandable, as I've tried to sometimes explain to people. Some people get it, some people don't. And of course, a little bit understandable. It is a little bit of a... Once you visualize it like this, I feel it is much easier to understand. But yeah, especially having this ratio, kind of considering that ratio between your crits and non-crits for Killer and how often that makes it activate, is actually a thing that I'm going to start doing as well for myself, just when I'm going to main Killer, if the Killer is really the pick that I'm going for that build. I might actually try to tailor it a little bit to kind of, if without losing too much in the DPS, if we can go in a setup that is better for Killer, might actually consider that just to get higher activations out of it. But yeah, of course, at the end of the day, the DPS is actually the main factor that we kind of want to go for. We don't want to give up too much there just for a bigger ratio, because we definitely could by making poor choices, like leaving out Fox's Prayer or something in a high end, let's say, where, yeah, you definitely want to keep that in. But yeah, it is one of those things to kind of consider. I kind of wanted to touch up on it here because I was trying to actually make this video or thinking of ways to kind of quantize this ages ago. I kind of gave up on it. It kind of left my mind. But now, of course, with Killer kind of coming back, it really, yeah, it was like, oh yeah, we should tackle this again. Especially as well as somebody snuck into my DMs as well and kind of went like, hey, doesn't builds actually make a difference here? Which is actually a thing that I hadn't considered really. I was more looking at, for instance, within Striker, just trying to understand like, oh yeah, we are getting it obviously kind of more than the percentages that we're kind of expecting, and trying to just understand that metric. But then going like, oh yeah, actually, yeah, of course, Killer adds in for itself as well. And then the build, of course, especially for instance here, having Umbra, which is then like the poster child of a crit damage build, the ratio there is completely different, and that will activate Killer more. And we could even consider in some ways to maybe tailor the build more towards Killer. So yeah, I hope you found this informative and kind of enjoyed the little ramble here. And yeah, maybe consider how Killer kind of works for in the future. For my next video, it's going to be the pistol. It is actually already recorded as we speak here, and yeah, it will follow this one up where we go into the pistol DPS sheet and kind of discuss pistols, especially in their DPS form against each other, not so much the headhunting form, but also very limitedly we'll jump into that into headhunter with them. And then, yeah, following this up will likely be the Pestilence build showcase, or following that up will be the Pestilence build showcase, and then MMRs, of course. And we have then done all of the weapon types, and also so then we'll follow that up with going into and continuing on with the character build collection updates, because 2 characters are remaining there. Once that is done, we're kind of freed from a lot of those, and I kind of want to go back to tackling a few guides and such, so that'll be up in the future. So yeah, if you did enjoy this video or found it informative, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below. That is always very much appreciated. And I hope to catch you in future videos. And as always, have a good night.